Hi, so we're live on the second meetup for the Orleans virtual meetup group. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined by Sergey and a few other guys from the and Gabriel from the product team of Orleans, and hopefully we're going to hear about the roadmap and some of the plans for open sourcing and some general Q&A. So please use the Jabber room to ask questions or ask on Twitter or anywhere else, and the team will try and answer the questions. So I shall keep speaking to a minimum and hand over to you guys.
Well, thank you, Richard. And first of all, thank you for setting this all up, the whole thing, and starting and doing the last one, which was great. And Jacob, thanks for presenting. Could we invite Hoop? He's hoop@somoa.com.
Okay, I'll try and do that in the background while you're carrying on.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm having some troubles with internet connection to phone, so I hope
you're breaking up. Yeah. Okay, so let me kick it off. So as we announced, we're open sourcing Orleans, which is the right thing to do, and it seems like everyone likes that. And the reason we did not open source right at the announcement, we just need to do some cleanup to make sure what we put out there is not confusing, makes sense. We had some net code from some previous internships. For example, Richard discovered this placement policy, which is graph partition. Very confusing for people, but it was not meant to be there for the general purpose. So we're finishing cleaning the code like that, but also need to figure out to learn how to do it the right way. Learn from the .NET folks who open source their stuff a bit earlier. Some tips and tricks how to do build, how to code sign stuff, and or strong naming, all of that stuff. Because again, you don't want to put something out there that confuses people and then rush to change it and fix it. So that's the only reason there's a bit of delay. But we're almost done. So there are questions about the roadmap and what to expect. The big thing that we have not talked about before, we mentioned it a couple of times in passing, but it is in the code base that you'll see very soon, is a set of streaming extensions to the API that should help simplify building reactive applications using Orleans. Consume events from event queues, like from Service Bus or Event Hub or Kafka. So you'll see it soon that an extension, we hope their initial extension to the program model, and another driver model there where you can build drivers for queuing systems and it can really work across a variety of queuing. The default is not the default. The one option is this direct TCP message, so with no persistence, not durable queues. But then other drivers can be for any system you like. The idea there that you write the same code and it works for all the systems without changing the line of code. So it's a notion of producer and consumer and streams that have names, just like Grain is a virtual actor that by knowing ID of Grain, you can talk to it, you can make calls to it. Similarly, the idea there is that you have data streams that have identities, and as long as you know the identity, you can start producing and consuming from that stream. And the goal there is also to support a high churn rate and streams being created and destroyed at very high rate. So it's for very dynamic systems.
So what does a stream look like? Is it a series of objects you throw at a method, or is it a event-based, or how does it look programmatically?
So it's very similar. It's kind of async RX. So it's observer of T and observable of T. So whatever you want T to be. But there's more there because, for example, you want to keep track of not timestamps. What's the word I'm missing? Sequence tokens, so that you can reliably recover and continue processing of stream from the point where you checkpoint. So there's things like that around kind of the basic API. You'll see them pretty soon.
So the consumers need to set checkpoints themselves and then subscribe to the known checkpoint in the stream. It's a stream transient. What is doing the checkpoints? Just a version of stream that is coming.
Is it just me? I can't really hear the question.
Yeah, we can't hear you very well.
Okay.
Perhaps you could type your question in the chat window or in Jabber, and one of us can read out.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So Ruben just posted a link to Jabber.
You said that you're using iObservable of T and the like, similar to RX. Does that mean that we can also use composition operators from RX, or is there something similar, or is it something we're going to have to build out?
Maybe Gabi, maybe you want to explain the subtle difference there.
So for now, we don't support by ourselves any compositional. Like you can write like select on those rollins returned observable or something like that. But the vision is in the future, maybe yes. But as of now, these are more like channels, pipes, if you want. You just publish into the stream, and you subscribe to the stream, and you just receive the messages, but you don't have all the feature operators that RX in .NET supports yet.
But that's fair enough. That sounds fine to me, especially because RX at the moment, the published version doesn't have any back pressure, right? And I imagine that that's something which you've got natively in there by nature of task of T, or is that right?
Exactly, yeah. So first thing we needed to do is actually to make it asynchronous RX, right? The interface have to be asynchronous, which is the current version of .NET is synchronous. Because you subscribe to a stream, like, you know, the producer is not on the same machine as a consumer. So it has to be, in a way, asynchronous. And then back pressure, there is one way will be just through the task that you published. When it's resolved, and like, you know, it arrives to the other side. But there are also other options as well. You can actually publish like without awaiting the task, and then there will be some kind of back pressure within it. Yes.
Yeah, so the composition is the goal. It's just since RX, I think version of RX isn't available yet, even though we work with those guys on aligning the APIs. So it's just a question of time, because that's the popular request, to make a composition truly synchronous.
Thanks. Yeah, that sounds great.
So this is one big thing that we haven't talked about. So one priority is for us will be to focus on performance of the streaming processing. This whole the project Folkestone is a separate code name, but really it's just streaming extensions. So that code base is already being used in production, and we need to make sure it's rock solid and very performant, as performant as we can get to it. So that will be one of the key priorities for us in the near future, at least. The other question we've been looking at is in-place upgrade to simplify kind of what everyone's been sort of complaining about. We have some ideas, and because of course there's version compatibility and issues. So if you 100% backwards compatible, you can upgrade today with just built-in Azure upgrade functionality. So it's really talking about incompatible upgrades where you forward compatible, backward compatible. So we're looking at that. We have some ideas. We've been doing some prototyping, but that's some work to do.
Haven't you got a problem there in that you can't remove an assembly from .NET's memory while it's running?
Exactly. Otherwise, we would have done it a long time ago.
Yeah, it would have been easy.
So the basic idea is to start a second set of silos on the same nodes. So can I join them to the cluster, but have within the runtime awareness of versions and compatibility, so that whenever a message arrives, a request arrives for a newer version of the grain, you can route it properly, and you can deactivate the old version transparently and activate a new one. That's sort of the basic premise I looked at. So you kind of get benefits of both worlds. You get version incompatibility support. At the same time, you don't have to do heavy lifting and manage. So it's kind of still transparent. So that's the goal. That's some early thinking.
That'd be cool. I think so a lot of people have been asking about that because it's such a strength of Erlang. I think if Erlang didn't do it, no one would ask.
Well, we still would ask.
Okay.
But you want to manage it kind of in a modern way.
Yeah.
Then there are like big areas that will really depend on sort of the community feedback and involvement. Like for example, my personal feeling was we're really behind in supporting smooth deployment to Azure with templates, project templates, and all kinds of stuff. And then Azure SDK has been evolving fast. So our hope is that with the help of community, we can improve that part of the story significantly, that we can just click, and then create and deploy and not mess with these questions like where are my config files and what is where.
So how could that work? I mean, you could perhaps have a standard cloud deployment package with the latest Orleans release in, and then be able to use that as a way of bootstrapping Orleans into a worker role, and then it could go and load your grain files in another process or something. I don't know. I spent a lot of my time bootstrapping stuff into worker roles. So that would be a simple way of doing it, but I don't know. People probably want to integrate Orleans into their build process, don't they? And do the whole traditional deployment model. I don't know. What were you thinking? How could we contribute and help you there, Sergey?
So the model that we've seen working well for customers of Orleans, and when you start Silo as a separate process. So in the worker role, you just create process, pass configure things like .NET garbage collection, which is really painful to do otherwise. And sort of your worker role is just a shell that runs there. And you can see from there, it's easy to get to dynamic deployment of binaries, right? So if you start a general host, then you can download the bits from say blob storage or from somewhere else. There are many options there. Like we just literally have time to invest ourselves and recognize the community. There are a lot of people that are much more experienced in doing this kind of stuff. And we hope with the help of the community we can make much better progress on that front.
There's one nice little feature in the Azure SDK for worker roles that allows you to include plugins. So that's how things like their diagnostics and remote desktop and some other features are added into worker roles and web roles. And you could theoretically release Orleans in that way as an SDK extension. I think you'd have to make a couple of really small adjustments to the connection strings for the diagnostics that Orleans uses, and that would be all you'd need to do. So maybe I'll take that offline with you as a crazy idea for implementing that.
Well, that's exactly the example of crazy ideas that I'm aware of or didn't think that way. That's exactly what we want your input and your contribution kind of right away, because most people run Orleans in Azure. By the way, George, did you get my request at Hoop? He was trying to get in, but he could hear us. But
he could possibly be listening to the stream of general viewers rather than presenters. Hoop, if you are listening, I've sent you a Twitter message with the correct link in. You could try that one. I don't think I have your email address, otherwise I could add you to the Hangout, but if anyone else does and is in the Hangout, you can just add him in to the call, I think.
I added it to the chat.
Okay.
Asking you if you missed that. So another area where we expect investing. So what we're going to release fairly soon is the Orleans with the streaming extensions. But what will be missing there initially is sort of a driver for GitHub, not for GitHub, for Event Hub. So that code is not ready yet because it's tied to the product code and we need some time to factor it out. So we'll have samples for Azure Queue and for direct messaging. But that's another area where it would help to create drivers for a bunch of queuing systems that people use. And performance is an interesting aspect there, how to optimize performance across different technologies and different subtleties. I think it work really well.
There's a few questions in the Orleans Jabber room. I don't know if you've got your eye on that, Sergey, or anyone else in the team, but I think it's Jacob's asking if you. I guess he hasn't got very good audio connection, but I can read a few of them out if you like.
Yeah, that would help.
Yeah. Will there be tighter integration with Azure? Namely, will I see an Orleans blade in the portal?
Probably not anytime soon.
No.
Because there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the Azure proper, and I think they're very careful what gets added as a first class.
I get the hint that features that require collaboration between two teams in Microsoft are often the harder ones to implement, are they? Because you got to work with their cadence and everything else.
In general, you want to dump a lot of stuff and say, yeah, there's this laundry list of options. They need to apply some thinking what to expose at the first level, kind of features and options.
Jacob also asks if there's a date for the project to appear on GitHub.
We really like any minute. Really pushing. If we're lucky, I was hoping it would be next week, but I can't promise because who knows, some snag can slow us down for another couple of days. We're really close to it, and if not holidays, it would have been done probably. Most people are out for 2 weeks.
Yeah. Are you going to actively develop using GitHub, or are you just going to push the latest version there periodically?
Well, what .NET folks recommended to us, and that's what we're going to try to adopt, is that GitHub is the main, and we ourselves will consume and sort of develop in branches and connect to GitHub. We're saying that Russell made a mistake of not doing that, and some people got really... It was just a snapshot that easily...
So maybe just to mention, maybe it's obvious, but I think it should be clearly said. We are going, the plan is to be completely on GitHub, allow community to submit pull requests. We do plan to take a pull request, integrate them back, and have the full support of the community. I mean, so the Orleans team is only 2 guys, Sergey and me at this point.
Okay.
We are limited a little bit by our resources.
Yeah.
Was taking feedback from the community, integrating those pull requests, and also working with our actual product that we are, so we will be limited there. But our goal is to have the full contributions and have it, live and get as much feedback and help from you as well. It's obvious, but I think it should be.
Getting a Travis build is probably one of your first things to do then, I think. Then at least you can see whether the pull requests compile, which should save you some time.
Yes.
CI is one of the things that we're trying to figure out before we push the code out, and we got conflicting data on that. PS Online versus Jenkins and things like that.
Yeah.
And probably, so we will start with something and probably keep improving that. We'll also release some of our unit tests, some small set of tests, and we'll add more from our internal pool of tests.
Yeah, that's the other thing that takes time, because we want to have working unit tests as part of the code release, but some of their important tests, they have some dependencies on infrastructure and some internals. So we're sorting those pieces out. So we'll start with initial set, and we'll keep moving stuff to GitHub until we move everything.
Mhm.
And there is a separate question about our distributed test that will probably take longer because we have infrastructure runs at least every night. It runs on a rack of machines and runs performance tests and load tests and things like that. So that's not easy to just share because nobody will be able to run it anyway.
That's true. A final question from Jacob here, which is, would you consider posting a list of issues on GitHub which the community could pick up and help with?
Absolutely.
Cool.
That's kind of what I started listing as an example. It's like the integration with Azure and better way of integrating it. There are questions about monitoring. Like for example, your silo monitor is getting popularity internally, so like, yes, how to contribute and maybe reuse it in some form.
Cool. Yeah, I kind of put that out there, seeing if anyone was interested in using it, whether it solved a problem at all, and if it did, I was going to go and improve it, but it's been dead quiet, so I haven't.
Yes, yeah. But we had discussion this last week. Some folks were asking if it would be a good idea for them to contribute to the project. Yeah. Absolutely.
Cool.
And there is like infinite list of this kind of things that we'll start putting on GitHub. Like event sourcing, right? That Jacob done. It's a great starting point, but I'm sure there's a lot more to do there, and people are interested in event sourcing in a big way.
Sergey, can you hear me, guys?
Oh,
yes.
Yeah, perfect.
Oh, great. It seems like the video with the voice is a bit slow and doesn't work, so no video from it. So we have a question. What do you think about getting rid of the static generator that is required to use Visual Studio, because it's a common source of annoyance, and also you guys from the F# community a bit cold on using Relins because they need to use Visual Studio to create the interfaces and all the stuff. What do you think about that direction?
Well, actually, that's a great question. I think there are actually 3 questions here.
Yeah.
One.
Yeah, it's all. Sorry, just probably once again was with my microphone. Okay, continue. Sorry.
That's great because I think it points to 3 issues. One, as we discovered, F# is really broken when it comes to custom TPL schedulers today, and I've been trying to ask F# community if they can fix that so that F# would run properly schedule-wise. And since F# is managed by a community, I don't know who else to ask. So that's the first thing. The second, I think, what you kind of alluded to is the binding today, or quote-unquote binding with F# is really C# style with interfaces on classes. And we realize that's not how people write most of F# code. But we're not F# experts, so if the community can look and suggest a different way of integrating F#, grains reading and F# without interfaces, I don't know if it's pattern matching or discriminating, whatever is the right mechanism, that would be a much better way of integrating F# than with interfaces. Which is, realistically, we'll have very little time for that. We can help, but we won't have time to do it.
Yeah, but isn't it? Yes, sure.
Go ahead.
But isn't it the problem because of the way how the Relins API is now designed? Like, I mean, it's a method-based API. You just create an interface and you can have some methods, and that's probably if you actually have a look at the file generated by Relins code game, and it's mostly about serialization and some other stuff that is probably could be more dynamic. And I mean, what's the problem with Sharp integration? Because if, for example, exchange messages, then it's all about serialization, and we now have a lot of good serialization formats, even the one that was open sourced by Microsoft recently. So I understand that the manual serialization of is the most performant solution available. But don't you think that this could be part of the problem?
I look at it as more an opportunity to support different options, because like, the reason we did this generation of serializers and code gen to some extent is to have better performance, to exclude reflection and whatnot. But there are other ways to do it now. So I mean, we welcome all of this, and in principle, the interface is very simple. So you send the ID of class and the method, and then you say the binary payload, right? Just the binary. So on top of that basic interface, different schemes could work in parallel with different protocols. I think it would be good to do that.
I think as a first step, we can just lift the build time code gen into runtime code gen, just much like ASP.NET does it, and that would probably solve a lot of the problems. I don't know what you guys think.
So that's actually interesting. You mentioned that's what we did 3 or 4 years ago. So we tried to generate it when the silo starts up, and then save the binary just to cache it. And we ran into some issues with cache. Sometimes it would break, and so we moved away. But that was a while ago when we didn't really invest much time in investigating what was not working.
Yeah. So now it's a lot easier nowadays, though, isn't it? Like with Roslyn and all, you can basically just take the same exact code DOM stuff that you've got, serialized stuff, and then just throw it at Roslyn, and it'll spit out an assembly, and it's pretty nice to work with. The only thing that really needs to change is that we need to move further away from those static interfaces, like grain observers, for example, still use static factories. So if we just, it's not a very big change. We just have to move further in the direction you're already going, I think.
But that's the direction we want to go together, because like this is kind of stuff that is easily parallelizable, and the different options that can be tried and tested. So we don't want to be like sort of hard gatekeepers here and say, no, it should be done this way. And I think things can be done in many different ways, and as long as we keep it logical and pluggable, all options should be available. All reasonable options should be available.
I think opening the source up and discussing these issues in public, in a public thread, has a lot of benefit, doesn't it? I think you get a lot of input and ideas and guidance, and I think if that's one thing as a community we could help you do is to contribute there, isn't it?
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely. That's the big reason to open source it, because like we will not have enough time ever to address all these questions. So we're not pretending we will.
I've got a couple more questions in the chat room. So Tim is asking about the automation of Orleans deployments, and there's an ongoing discussion about how you can use Octopus deploy and TeamCity, and I guess the question is, what in your experience, what are people doing for automating deployment to Azure? What techniques are working, and or what do you use internally?
Well, I don't know if we can hear Hoop, because he could talk from a 343 experience perspective. He's saying that the link seemed to take him to the broadcast. Still can't get in.
Yeah, I'm having a chat with Hoop, and he unfortunately can't seem to get in.
So as I understand, like they have a bunch of PowerShell scripts that use Azure management APIs to deploy, automate deployment. So it's one option of going. Oh, sorry. Somebody's trying to call. So that's one option, definitely. Some people just deploy from Visual Studio. That's okay. Why not? I personally am not aware what are the best options, what are the best practices. I mean, you guys probably know better. We've been focusing more in terms of Orleans than on sort of, the Azure stuff. That's why we're kind of behind on some of these deployment features.
Ruben, you're in production, aren't you? What are you doing?
I just use right-click, publish in Visual Studio. So that works pretty well for us. But you remember I complain a lot about deployment times, and really, it's not the Orleans, it's not the fault of Orleans. It actually is just the Azure infrastructure really, which is getting in my way there. Because you have to upload such huge amounts of binaries and copy them around a few times before you deploy it. So, in-place upgrades would be great, or something along the lines of that, where we don't have to, wipe VMs and create new ones in their place. But that's what we're doing at the moment. It's not too bad. I think it takes maybe about 20 minutes for a deployment, which is it's okay. But if stuff hits the fan, then and you're in a pinch and you need to push out a quick fix, it can be a bit frustrating. So.
But this is where in-place upgrade and deployment, where your work role is really a shell that starts processes, where you stop the old one or start a new one in parallel and migrate code. This kind of approach hopefully will simplify just upgrades and deployments that you don't need to deploy VMs. You keep your VMs running or work role instances. And that's actually the model that Hoop dreamed up, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. We haven't implemented it yet. To just have sort of the management layer that starts early in silos, and potentially across multiple services with different configuration on the same set of VMs. So again,
I think that's a good thing for the community to tackle. Maybe we can have a discussion about how to exactly implement something like that in GitHub, and then go and do it. But as a side, if we were to use that model, then that would make it a lot easier to also have web front ends on the same roles as Orleans silos, because currently we can't do that because it's very difficult to have an Orleans client in the same app domain as an Orleans silo. So I guess it would be a nicer side if we were to do that.
I think you can do that.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I've certainly run the silos in web roles, co-hosting them.
In the same app domain?
Well, the way worker and web roles work in Azure is they're in the worker role aspect of your assembly will be hosted in a separate app domain. So you basically got two processes, one for the web, one for the worker. So you're fine.
Okay.
Some interesting trick. I don't quite understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, maybe I'll write a blog post about it.
That's good. Sounds good. We can save costs if we can high density host.
Yeah.
But there is also the security aspect there. So you need to be careful of putting your backend, your say silos, on machines that have external endpoints. So we've been paranoid about security company for 15 years now.
I've got another question from Jacob here, somewhere up this thread, which says, have you got any plans or ideas for other Azure services you'd like to integrate with, or would like help integrating with?
Well, I mentioned streaming, right? So that's Event Hub is the great technology there, that has high throughput, low latency, reliable messaging. Jacob, what are your suggestions? I can think of monitoring, because there's a lot of investment in application monitoring in Azure right now, but I'm not sure how much of it is already available.
He's saying auto-scaling and monitoring, as you said. It'd be interesting if you could scale according to number of grains in each silo, and all the information's there. You just need the code to monitor the number of activations and do the scale accordingly, don't you?
Well, it's a very interesting question what to use as a criteria or what kind of function for scaling, because just taking activations, those activations are idle, so the sheer number of them doesn't tell you anything. And we've been kind of looking at this question for quite some time and discussing internally and trying various options. It's a very kind of fundamental question, what to use as a factor of load. Like we started with the CPU, but CPU is kind of not very reliable metric either, surprisingly. I mean, Gavi's done a lot of research in that with interns. Like I said, a number of activations really depend on how active or idle they are, because it's beneficial for some application to keep them in memory for a long time. It's just the cache that you don't have to reinitialize if grains are used. And the applications are different, and the churn rate are different. So like, I'm not sure if there is a single recipe here. So it could be interesting to tackle this problem together.
What I think was meant is there is this. We can have a statistics based on which some controller needs to make a decision whether a silo should be added or not. So there is Azure supports this pluggable controller that basically you just give him statistics and some rules, and he decides to add instance or not. So that would be great to integrate with that. But then there is still a question of like, what are the exact rules, right, to decide? And this could be, of course, pluggable, and everyone can like decide by his own. But it's tricky. That's what we were saying. To decide when you add a new instance. Is it just based on CPU? Then it's good, but then CPU is spiky a lot of times. You don't want to immediately start adding instances when CPU just goes a little bit beyond some threshold. So there's a lot of smartness there. But that's kind of orthogonal to the mechanisms of having that controller, being able to publish some data, like some statistical performance counters there, and make a decision versus the policy of what actually publish, right?
Am I also right in thinking that you don't really want to be scaling up and down all the time anyway, because you're trying to keep a working set of grains in memory, and if you scale up, then you then got to fill it with new activations or something. It doesn't immediately solve your problem, does it?
Exactly. So you do want to scale up and down, or maybe not like on every 5 minutes, and so it's tricky to make it smooth, right?
Yeah.
But that's really like this is a policies versus the mechanism, which is this controller, right? So integrating with the mechanism is great. Which policies to use, that's a little bit trickier, but
yeah, I think you have to let people write their own, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly, because there is no like one recipe that will work for everyone.
Yeah. So I think all the parts are there really. You think you can already get the CPU and the amount of RAM and probably the response time out of your own metrics.
Yes.
And then Azure provides the scaling API, so I don't think there's much you need to add there, other than perhaps surfacing things like, I don't know, maybe the queue length a little easier.
Well, remember, like we had this discussion on Codeplex, I think with Evgen, and what I suggested is to start with monitoring the business metrics. Like, for example, if latency is important for you, measure latency. It doesn't matter what CPU load or number of activations. That may be your criteria, or number of failed requests to storage, or number of errors. There are different metrics that are important for different businesses. So that's kind of catch-all sort of approach. But then next level will be to detail what on the kind of technical level you want to monitor.
I've got another question here. How are people indexing grains for later retrieval? I guess that's, what storage provider are people using under the covers?
I think we've had these conversations several times for sure, but I can't recall anybody actually using indexing. I think people have been coming and asking, how can I find a grain? So we explained that if you use storage, you can store and query that your storage layer supports it, or you can have index grains that will keep your index and update dynamically. So we've kind of given this two suggestions, but I don't recall, Gabi, do you that people actually implemented any of this?
Yeah, we don't know anyone that actually implemented and used it like at scale, let's say. Maybe some. We were ourselves very early had this implemented, and that's but we kind of removed that because we couldn't make it really be scalable, let's say this way, and we didn't need that feature as well.
I see that Hoop finally joined us. Hoop, are you in?
So,
Hey guys.
oh, hey.
Glad you got there in the end. Sorry about all the trouble. I don't know what was going on there.
No problem. Thanks.
So you can tell us all that we were wrong so far for minutes.
Everything. I think I agree with pretty much everything Sergey and Gabby have been saying. We don't use any persistent stuff in Halo, but that's mostly because we were working on that on the part that would have used it before it was landed. And as far as deployment goes, we have a custom mix of PowerShell scripts and a deployment website that we threw together to be able to do our own deployments using the Azure APIs.
Okay, so I didn't lie.
So you're using some kind of automated build system, are you? And then just using the regular PowerShell to push up your CS pack files and deploy that?
Yeah, we have a system we wrote, because internally we use TFS, so we have a system we wrote to allow us to do continuous integration, well, using TFS continuous integration, but pushing all the way to Azure and to various environments, because we push to one environment, validate, and then if it's okay, then we push it to another more broadly available environment.
Yeah, cool.
As a side note, we were originally using TFS or Visual Studio Online for doing the same things. It's pretty easy actually to configure TFS to just deploy continuously to Azure, so you can have your Orleans silos continuously deployed if that's what you want.
So I had a question I'd like to ask Hoop, and that's what are his experiences in running Orleans at scale for a long period of time, and what second part of that question is what does failure look like? What are the common failure scenarios, and what do you have to do to accommodate those? Are you putting retry logic in your code and things like that, or is it just a matter of trying to monitor this stuff? Over to you.
So we do have quite a bit of retry logic. One of the things that we've learned over time is things that to be very diligent about monitoring external dependencies. So think, for example, if you're talking to Azure Storage, or if you're making an API call to, let's say you're using Twilio for something, if your external service goes down and you have a lot of calls going to that external service, that causes your grains to get backed up because every grain is single-threaded. And as one grain gets backed up, all the grains calling it get backed up. And so you can slowly see this the cascading failures throughout your system if you're not monitoring your dependencies properly. So that's something that we learn to monitor. We have very strict retry logic. We're getting very much better at being very constrained in our timeouts to external systems as well. One thing that we don't have widely implemented, but that we're looking into, is implementing circuit breaker patterns for all our external dependencies, so that we can get rid of the other problem that you might see is if you have a lot of very slow calls to an external dependency, that can also result in problems. If your timeouts in Orleans are shorter than your timeouts to an external dependency, that could also be a little bit of an issue. So that's probably one of the areas that we look at as far as tuning runtime behavior to minimize situations where you have a lot of unavailability. I don't know if that answers your question.
That does. Some very interesting points there. I'm quickly noting down circuit breaker pattern. Think about that a bit more. So that's where one grain detects a failure in an external service and then marks it as failed, and until
yes,
time as you do.
Yes, but more importantly than a failure is if you have a lot of calls timing out. Because let's say Azure Storage it's not offline, but it's running extremely slow, that can actually be worse than Azure Storage being offline, because all of your calls are running so slow that they're backing up every single call to Azure Storage, and so now your entire cluster of silos starts running slow, and then you have cascading timeouts because your queues end up getting too large for each grain. So what we'd ideally like to do is, in a situation where an external dependency is running really slow, we'd like to immediately treat it as though it was offline if we can afford to, rather than having a slow service, because a service that you assume is dead might be better. And that's something that we want to do we want to do in a more consistent way where we can call external services and have a wrapper that we can put on all our calls that will say time the calls out, keep track of all calls that go above a certain threshold, and if more than a certain number happen, flip the circuit breaker. But we're still toying around with what that means in terms of once you flip the circuit breaker, when do you choose to bring the service back online? What percentage of calls do you allow through when you flip the circuit breaker? And we're basically implementing that in some of our services. And once we've got a good understanding of it, then we probably try and figure out how to generalize that pattern for other people.
That sounds really interesting. We have so I've started with the help of Yevon, who's on the call as well, documenting a few design patterns which are related to Orleans and putting them on GitHub. I don't know if you've seen them, but it'd be really good to get some of your thoughts on those and fill in the spaces we've missed.
Oh, that sounds really cool. Can you send me a link to that on GitHub, and I will actually forward that to other people on the team as well and get more feedback.
Be great. Yes, it's very much early stages at the moment, so yeah, don't expect much.
There is another document that Hatay Tuna wrote, which he was gonna publish like last week, and then he was looking where to put his code. I suggested Orleans contribute.
Cool.
So we will at some point we'll merge this design patterns probably.
Yeah, that'd be good. Have you got any other questions from guys on the call?
And actually, a question on Jabber from Cloud Rocket. I think it's Todd. Like, how long does it take to distribute grains running on, say, silos? It's maybe silos to a third. The silos aren't overloaded before or after. So, yeah, 2 silos to a third. So, at the moment, how the runtime works, we don't actively migrate grains. We don't rebalance actively. So you had 2 silos running and you had 100,000 grains there. You start a third silo, nothing's going to happen. It's only new activations that some percentage of them will be placed on the third silo. This is another area for a lot of interesting policies and improvements. So we put just one policy for now that's based on number of activations, which, as I already mentioned, is not a perfect variable to monitor. It's just the start. And we've done some. We had an internship, an intern who did prototype active migration, but it's not integrated yet. So it's something that we'll look to put in some point in the future. I hope I didn't talk too much.
So which of the placement policies do you think is the most appropriate normally? Is it the one which will least activations? That seems to make sense to me. Or are there use cases where other policies would be better?
I'd say the most useful are random in reality when it comes down to it. The one I forgot, Gabi, you remember how it's called?
Yeah, so the random is usually the one we, for now, like it's the default one. If you don't specify anything, it's random. And then the other one we just build is this, we call it activation count based, which will basically equalize the amount of the number of activations on the silo. So if you're running on 2 silos and brought a third one, if no new grains are ever created, that other one will be idle. But once new activations have to be created, they will preferentially be created on that third silo. So it will be allow this third silo to pick up quicker, right? So it really helps when, like with the elasticity basic, you brought new silo and it will be picked up quicker. But it's now done on number of activations, and it could be also done on number of activations and CPU and maybe something else, like latency. So this is back to the policy question.
Yeah, and just to stress it, so this very simplistic policy is useful but dangerous at the same time, because if you have activations that are, say, 2 hours old, they were last touched 2 hours ago or an hour ago, so they're not really spending in resources, and you start placing all new activation to a third silo, you can easily run into a situation that the third silo will be doing all the work, and the 2 ones will do much less. So kind of balancing the actual work versus balancing number of activations, that's the challenge. It's still an open question. So this is just a building block, this new policy. It's not an ultimate solution.
Cool. Will we be able to invent our own policies, do you think? I don't know what my policy would be.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It will be it's very easy because, well, so it's very easy to hook up another placement policy, and the runtime already has a mechanism like every silo reporting statistics to every other silo. You can change the frequency there and then another statistics there as well.
Yeah.
And so like the mechanisms of adding new policy, it's easy. The policy code is tiny. Just kind of very carefully testing it in all different scenarios. Sure, it's smooth.
A little bit harder, yeah.
Challenging. So random is really like a safe bet, safest, but like not optimal. In a lot of scenarios, we know it's not optimal, right?
Yeah. But it's a good starting point, yeah.
In particular, it's not optimal in, say, rolling upgrades, where Azure deploys a patch and shuts down one of the update domains and then restarts. So those scenarios are not optimal with runtime.
It would be good to change the policy at runtime, wouldn't it? I don't know if that's something that could be achievable.
But that should be pretty easy. We have some config values that can be changed at runtime, for example, login levels and something else I don't remember right now. So that's easy. We have mechanism, we have management API to push things like that. Kind of solving the problem in the first place is what's interesting.
I've got another question from Jacob here, who I think has just dropped off the call, but mainly at Hoop, but I guess anyone can answer. Is how do you have unit tests for grains in Halo, and what's the integration story for unit testing or integration testing?
So we have unit tests for grains. One of the things we found is it's somewhat hard to test a grain outside of a silo, especially as grains get more complicated. As soon as the grain is making a call that invokes the Orleans scheduler, you can't test the grain outside of an Orleans silo. So we have a lot of shared libraries that we do anything that is common across grains that we can unit test without putting it inside a grain. We do normal unit testing with that. And then a lot of the grains, we will just spin up a silo to do some of the tests that we need to run. There's nothing that stops you from spinning up a silo class inside of a unit test. I don't have a good stance on how much we do that in our day-to-day unit tests. It's something that's possible to do, but I don't know that we do that a large amount. And then we obviously actually do full deployments and run tests that way as well.
Hoop, do you use reentrant grains?
So let me. So the code that we're going to release on GitHub, it will have a unit test project, which is actually quite similar to the unit tester project that is on Codeplex as well. It's basically a very easy way to start within your test process, start 1 or 2 silos and the client, and run like normal grains. So we will have that code and some maybe like 20, 30 unit tests as initial number of tests. And internally we have like 500-600 unit tests that we run with each our BVT. They all run in those silos that are hosted in the same process in different subdomains. And we'll be moving more and more of those unit tests into GitHub. Just we just want to clean up, and there's like lot of duplicate unit tests, so we're just moving them. So unit testing is really easy.
Yeah, if you're using the unit tester that's on Codeplex, that's you have a great sense of how it works. That's exactly the same. Just cleaned up. So there was a question to Hoop about re-entering grain, right?
Yeah, right.
I think that there was one case where we planned on using it. Sergey, do you remember if we actually used it in presence?
I think you do use it in several cases.
What was the question?
Was you use re-entered grains or not? I'm asking just because I'm thinking if you don't use zero-entry grains and everything is actually run single-threaded, then it should not be a problem to unit test grains with you don't need to actually spin up the silo and test the grains actually, because you just need to test the interactions between the grains, and that doesn't require the framework. And same for the scheduler. If you, for example, think about scheduler as just a some service that you can inject and test an interaction of the grain with the scheduler, then it's completely possible to run just a normal unit test without spinning up the silo and all that stuff. I'm actually doing this in one of my projects, and if you have a look at the Erling's bus, it's pretty easy. It's just a matter of having a proper dependency injection, and it's one of the pain points with Erling's absence of the ability to have you specify your own activation, activator, or other stuff like inject dependencies to a third-party services and all of that. It's something that's definitely need to be addressed in my view.
Well, I think it's slightly more complicated than that, because even if you're not calling not a grain, you're calling say async API, so that call through TPL gets routed through task scheduler, and injecting your own, I don't think it's a trivial thing, because just task scheduler is a complicated beast by itself.
Grains without any issues. So it's not about the scheduler, because you can write the async test and everything will be working, and async await all of that stuff as well, and it's supported by unit test runners. So it's not really a problem. And if you're sending just the messages to another grain, well, you can just simply sniff what is being sent and assert it. Like you just test it. It's the unit test. It's supposed to, if there is an interaction between different grains, then each grain is the API on its own, have its own protocol how you can communicate with it. And you only need to test, what messages are sent in one direction or another. You always test the single grain in isolation. That is the property of the unit testing. You can test something in isolation. So if you don't use reentrant grains, you don't need to actually check how it works, because we all know how it's complex to test multi-threaded code, and the message interleaving is close to that. So in case when you don't use reentrant grains, you just create the object and you just test the object. That's it.
I don't think it's true, because, for example, if you send two calls up one after another, they should be. So if, let's say if it's non-reentrant grain, you made a call and then you immediately make a second call.
Yeah.
You can show on finish, right? There's a queue, like they're serialized. So if you don't have that logic, then you will execute two calls in parallel. Now you can say you never in your unit test send two calls before you're waiting the previous one. That's great, but then you're not. So I think it's definitely possible to test grains in isolation. Of course it can work. I think the point of unit test is to test, as close as, to test your code in an environment that is as close as possible to your production environment. And so it's closer to production environment when you test it in silo, in up domain, and then test it in complete isolation. But also advanced, so you can do that.
Yeah, so to put what Gabby's saying a different way, from the way I think about it, there are things that I can write inside a grain that will make assumptions about the Orleans runtime environment, about things like the queuing and single-threaded nature of a grain. And if I write my unit test without those constraints being applied, then my unit test could result in false negatives where it says something's broken and it's not. Additionally, if I don't have those constraints there and I write code that would fail under those constraints, then I'll result in a false positive for my unit test, which might be okay. There's still stuff that I can get out of the unit test, but we want to avoid a situation where we have unit tests either passing or failing, and that's not actually the case. So being able to lean on, and actually now that Gabby mentions the unit test framework, I think some of the devs on our team actually were looking into that. So I might want to follow up and see whether we're actually using that in some of our testing. But having something like that that makes it possible to write a unit test that is driven by the silo code also running, because this is still just .NET code, is useful to us.
I completely agree with you because definitely, but we're actually talking about the integration test when you test the integration of how everything it works. In unit test is a bit different in that regard, and now actually I was talking about the unit test where you can test stuff in isolation and just imagine that you have all that of assumptions. That's your constraints. Everything is single-threaded. You understand the protocol of the other objects. There is no point to test, two things. And the same things you have with the external interfaces. You always work against some of the API. It's up to you whether you mock it or just use the real dependency. But the other grains, they not need to be necessarily tested within the same unit test. I mean, the interaction between different grains. You always test the single grain, and that's it. That's his assumption that I made.
Oh, I think I agree with the assertion that if I'm calling it a unit test, then I should only be talking to one grain or using one grain, but I still want it running within the context of whatever environment, or at least any other things in the environment that I consider to be invariant. It's kind of like I could probably write some sort of unit test that didn't use the entirety of the .NET framework, but almost anybody writing unit tests runs them. Their class code is running on the .NET framework. We consider the Orleans runtime to be an extension of the .NET runtime, and so we think it's okay to have the silo runtime code running within the unit test alongside the grain. But I agree with you that I wouldn't call it a unit test if I have two grains running, and if I go to the point where I have two silos and then they're communicating, there's grains in each silo communicating, I wouldn't call that a unit test. But that's still also something that we think is useful, because it's nice to be able to simulate some of the interaction between silos without having to deploy to Azure and do all of this inside the cloud environment. Being able to spin it up inside of an MS test environment is still useful to us, we think.
Yeah, definitely. It's like everyone just choose the proper level of testing, which is specific to its own situation. Okay.
Cool. Well, we've reached the top of the hour, so we should draw it to a close and let these guys get back to open sourcing Orleans. And
Yeah.
thanks very much, everyone, for joining and asking questions and contributing, and really appreciate your time.
Thanks, guys.
We'll try and do another one of these in a month's time, and hopefully get Yevhen or Ruben talking about what they've been up to.
Yeah, I hope
Sounds good.
Thanks, everyone.
See you guys.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.